Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you giving me space to sort of talk about sort of one of my labors of love. My name is Alfredo Carlos. I'm a faculty member at Cal State Long Beach in Political Science and Chicano Latino Studies. I'm also the founder of a new organization called the Foundation for Economic Democracy, which I'm really happy to be collaborating with folks on trying to build a democratic economy, and trying to answer some of these really difficult questions. How do we do it? Right? Not just theoretically, which, a lot of people are sort of involved in that conversation, but like the very nitty gritty on the ground. And a lot of that sort of involves sort of money. And so let me sort of start out with introducing how I came to this in terms of, I'm sort of long kind of personal trajectory, but I'm trying to go really fast through it. I grew up here in LA. I'm actually an immigrant. I was born in Mexico. I was undocumented until I was the age of 12. My parents were laborers. I talked about my dad earlier. He worked at Save-On for most of his life. My mom, she worked at sewing machine factories. She lost her job a couple times. The jobs got exported to Mexico because of free trade agreements. And so I grew up in a poor neighborhood, never realizing I was poor until I got older, because when you're in it, you don't really, you're growing up and that's normal, right? I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment with like 8 people at times. And so even though I am Mexican, I consider myself Chicano. One of the sort of the primary identifiers that I always identify with is I'm working class. Even though I'm a professor now, like most of my life trajectory, I associate myself with working class people. These questions of growing up in sort of working class neighborhood, it was a gang neighborhood also, and I'm not telling you that to get any kind of street cred. Like I wasn't part of the gang. My uncle was, but like I was always like sort of sheltered from that because of my parents. But I grew up sort of noticing a lot of discrepancies. A lot of I lived on the border of Torrance. I don't know if you all know Torrance. It's sort of a southern part of the West Side, really a middle income neighborhood. But like on my mailing address, it said Torrance, but I know that I wasn't part of Torrance because when I crossed the street, Torrance PD would tell me to go back to my side of the street. And I was like, 8 years old riding my bike with my friends. And so growing up, I always had these questions of like, why is it nicer over there than over here? Why do we get bused to Gardena to like a school that is surrounded by nice houses, but we live in apartment buildings that are really like crummy? And these questions sort of like guided my interests when I went to college. I went to UCSB and I studied history and Chicano studies there. And I studied working class history. I studied sort of the history of capitalism, sort of economics, inequality, sort of a lot of these questions that guided me. I got involved in social justice work. I did a lot of community organizing while I was up there. I got involved in like, community centers and doing cultural events. But it was always really around issues of like, how do workers achieve dignity for themselves? Particularly, I got involved in the Living Wage Coalition up there. So way before we were talking about, raising the wage to $15, people were talking about a living wage. What does that mean? And it's sort of oxymoronic because a minimum wage is supposed to be a living wage. And somewhere like those two concepts kind of differed. I worked a lot with at-risk youth, which is actually what led me towards the path of studying sort of solutions to these problems. I was working with truant kids for the district attorney's office in Santa Barbara. My job was to keep truant kids off of probation. So they were already kind of they were in that, what do they call that? The pipeline, the education to prison pipeline, right? Like they were like on that path. My job was to kind of be an interventionist. So my job was to follow them around and make sure they went to their programs, after school programs. And it was a really difficult job. I had a caseload of 60 students, and out of those 60 students that I remember, maybe 10 of them like graduated high school like on time. And so I have a lot of respect for social workers because of that. But one of the things that I realized is that these kids didn't need these programs. What they needed was their parents to work one job that paid them well so that they could be home in the afternoons to take care of their kids, to provide the resources that they need for after school programs when the students began to struggle, not like way after the fact once they've already kind of started the path. And so that got me to sort of think about, and I also feel really defeated, honestly. I felt defeated in the sense that I felt like I was putting Band-Aids on gushing wounds. And everywhere I looked, it was like gushing. And so I saved one kid, but like 15 or 20 like fell through the cracks. And so I started thinking like, there's a lot of people that are doing the anti-racist work, the social justice, the protesting stuff, And I was involved in those movements as well in Santa Barbara. But I was also asking, well, who's doing the work of really trying to like figure out like big picture solutions to what really I saw as an economic sort of problem. Our current economy, as you mentioned, sort of is guided by exploitation. Exploitation has existed in other forms, feudalist exploitation, slaves existed before capitalism. But the uniqueness of the exploitation that exists in our current economy is really an exploitation in which the worker is divorced from the value that they produce. And it's the first time in sort of human history where like you produce something and it's no longer yours to control in terms of you get to sell it or whatever. It's not like Etsy, you all know Etsy. Like that's how things used to function. You made stuff and you made the decision who you wanted to sell it to, what price, and those kinds of things. I mean, the price had to be fair for somebody else to buy it. But the sort of the uniqueness of capitalism is this is the first time that we organize an economy around the social relations in which the worker doesn't own that which he or she produces. And thus is also like alien, you guys hear of alienation, is alienated from that thing they produce. So there's also kind of like a moral like problem or moral exploitation in the sense that they're not connected to the work they do. And this is where you get, the sort of self-loathing, you don't feel like you're producing anything sort of valuable. So anyways, so long story short, I left the job I had in Santa Barbara to try to answer these questions. So I went to grad school to try to really understand these. And I felt really isolated, honestly, in grad school. Like, a lot of people were sort of studying like racial issues and studying like racial issues apart from economic ones. And for me, they were always intertwined. And so I sort of struggled with this, and I really sought to sort of understand that. And I came across, obviously some, radical literature, Marxist literature, critical political economy. And I came across this concept known as economic democracy. And I wanted to understand what that was. And my goal, because I was involved in sort of social justice work, was never just to go to grad school and get a professor's job. Like I'm actually interested in like praxis. How do we do it? Like I want to know like what the alternatives are, so I can work with folks to like try to implement them. And so I've presented some of this stuff at like conferences and stuff, and I really apologize. I was at another conference this week, so I didn't have a chance to kind of pare this down. So some of it is really legalese and scholarly, so I apologize for that, and I'll skip through some of that part or try to like explain it shortly. But by way of a sort of long introduction, that's how I came to really study cooperatives, mainly as really seeing a vehicle for people not just to have good jobs, those are important, but really to feel valued and to have dignity. At the end of the day, the thing that sort of always frustrated me about my parents' jobs is that they got home and they never felt like they were valued at work. And they didn't feel like they had dignity at work. And that's really what drives sort of my interest in this, beyond sort of just the financial benefits of cooperatives, is that I think an economy that, that is cooperative needs to also be like dignified, right? And I think it can be if you do it right, if you do consensus and sort of you work on those issues. That's your phone trying to tell me to move on. Let's start with the first slide. And so I come from sort of the reference of really thinking about social science, and I'm gonna go really quickly through these quotes, and so that you kind of see how I approach studying this stuff, but at the same time, my interest in like not just wanting to study this stuff, but do it. That's known as sort of emancipatory social science. Like, I don't just want to study things out there because they seem interesting, or like, oh, look at this, and this statistics of people do this, and that statistics of people do that. Like, I'm actually interested in transforming like the way in which our society functions to the values that I think will allow us to live here for much longer than currently like our timeline looks like it's gonna last. Essentially, I'm using sort of Gramsci's sort of theory of sort of hegemony and complexity to kind of see how like a lot of these different things fit. There's these things, especially in universities, where people try to separate out, like there's class, there's race, or there's society, there's politics, there's economy. These things are separate fields, but you can't ever really separate them. Like the economy is made up of people. And one of the things I ask my students a lot is like, define economy to me. And they think it's some sort of complicated answer. And an economy is just the way in which we organize getting the daily things that we need to survive. That's all an economy is. It's not sort of this abstract kind of thought that like, oh, this big capitalist economy. All capitalism is that we organize how we socially produce the goods that we need to survive, the roofs that we need to live under, the food that we need to eat, like how we organize that. And in the society, we organize it very hierarchically and privately owned. And when I say privately owned, I don't mean like your iPhones, like I'm gonna take, people are scared of communists because like, oh, they're gonna take your iPhones and your toothbrushes. Nobody wants your toothbrush, you can keep your toothbrush. I'm talking about like private resource property. So, I mentioned earlier, that capitalism was having a hard time develop like during the homestead period because people were like given the option, do I want to go work on a plantation or do I want to go like have my own piece of property and fend for myself? And people were like, get my own property. Why am I going to go work for somebody else when I can work for myself? And so the system only functions if you have a captive labor force. And so I'm sort of getting ahead of myself, but I do that. The system, the system is basically, look, it's not important to just study this stuff. Let's not just talk about it. Let's actually do it. That's all these sort of quotes say. And it's really kind of like based on sort of critical philosophy. Marx said, the philosophers and academics, I put academics myself, have only really interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. The reason he did the work that he did is because he wanted to change society. He didn't just want us to be like, that's interesting. Let me have some wine and cheese and talk about interesting things. And so I engaged in essentially what's known as what I consider democratic research, action research. It's research where you're working with communities to find solutions to problems. I'm happy to sort of send the whole PowerPoint to you all so you can have it. But like I don't want to especially because the screen's small. But it's really kind of a praxis-oriented methodology. Like, for instance, right now I'm working with, I'm beginning to start a research project in the city of Long Beach, talking about what are some of the issues that certain districts face outside of health issues. The west side of Long Beach, the west side of Long Beach suffers from like food deserts and also banking institutions. They don't have any banks. So they have predatory payday lenders there. And so how do we fix that? And so one of the ways is that we're sort of having conversations around how do we establish a credit union there? Is there a way we can like connect with a credit union who's not currently in Long Beach to open up like a center there, or even just do pop-up banking where, the first of the month, they just show up and actually cash people's checks. So like trying to sort of engage those conversations and sort of solutions. It's essentially a participatory democratic process concerned with developing practical knowledge, practical knowing, and the pursuit of sort of a worthwhile human purpose. Its roots really lie in like, how do you do research that solves people's problems? That's, it's pedagogy of the oppressed, really. Like, how do you engage in a process of learning and teaching and doing that is liberatory for everyone? And so for my research, I actually did a case study on worker cooperatives in the Bay Area. I interviewed people from different sort of worker cooperatives that use different models. There was sort of the incubation model, which is the nonprofit helps start a cooperative. And they kind of baby it along until it's sort of fully fledged, and then they kind of let it go off autonomously. I also interviewed people who were part of the Arizmendi Bakery Association, and they shared their model with me in terms of how it's a franchise model. It's not a nonprofit; it's completely for-profit business, and they have an association that does the same thing, but they wanted to make sure that it was able to compete in market conditions. And there's a lot of sort of other kind of things that they did. And so I did qualitative research. I interviewed a bunch of the workers, got a lot of different perspectives on their job, what they thought about their worker cooperative, some of the problems they encountered. And I was able to collect a lot of different types of data that I put in my dissertation. But one of the things that really kind of stuck out to me was how self-reflective people were about sort of issues around race, gender, LGBTQ issues, sort of identity issues, but at the same time sort of economic processes that were going on around them, specifically like issues like gentrification. So what follows is essentially, I'm going to read one of the things that I think is really important about a lot of this is at the end of the day, we can study the economy and all that. I'm really interested in sort of telling people stories. And I know this is in Spanish. Don't worry, I translated it. But sort of the way in which I was introduced to all this is actually happened in Cuba. So I was looking up sort of alternatives to capitalism, YouTube stuff, and I came across a video that I'm going to show. You all sort of know the story of Cuba. Like, the United States sanctions, economic sanctions them. They have a really difficult time in their economy. But they were subsidized by the Soviet Union for a really long time. And right after 1990, in Cuba, there was this period known as the special period. They used to import all their oil from the Soviet Union, and they would send back sugar. But overnight, after the Soviet Union collapsed, they didn't have any oil. Like, think about what that did to their economy. What did that prevent them from doing?
Developing any kind of heavy industry after the Soviet Union.
So no heavy industry.
Can't drive the cars, trucks.
Can't drive the cars, trucks. Which cars do you need to drive, and which trucks do you need to drive to survive?
Ambulances, fire trucks.
Think about where your food's coming from. Farming, right? So one of the things that happened is that they had food that they were growing out in the country that they could overnight not transport to the cities because there was no oil. And so they had to figure out a way to deal with this sort of food insecurity that just happened kind of overnight. And one of the things that they did is they started essentially cooperative urban farming. So a lot of people don't recognize that the urban farming kind of craze that's going on here in the United States, a lot of it actually originated in Cuba because of the need for the fact that people in the cities needed to eat. And there was no ways, it was really expensive to try to pay somebody who was gonna go out, maybe they had horses or old buggies, and some of the cars maybe still worked. This is also where they're developing kind of their own brakes and mechanic sort of solutions, and they actually started developing kind of ethanol stuff, and all kinds of ways to get the engines going. But this is one of the ways that they dealt with that.
A raíz de lo que se llamó el periodo especial, la situación económica que se creó después del derrumbe del campo socialista y de la desaparición de la Unión Soviética, la carencia de recursos alimenticios aquí en la capital nos obligó a tomar esta alternativa como un paliativo, una especie de solución al problema alimentario que se estaba dando en Cuba. Y ha sido realmente una solución tan importante que lo hemos mantenido como un proyecto de desarrollo de la alimentación aquí en nuestro país.
Market agropecuario in the States.
Después de los años 90, el año 94, que fue el año más malo del periodo especial, no había casi nada. Íbamos al campo, a donde estaba el guajiro. Guajiro es la persona quien trabaja la tierra, y comprábamos.
Determinamos qué áreas eran las más propicias y con ellas empezamos a trabajar en ello. Aquí nosotros estamos presentes en un entorno organopónico que puede ver, está rodeado de edificios por todos los lugares, una agricultura eminentemente urbana.
Ustedes están en una cooperativa urbana, una UBPC, Unidad Básica de Producción Cooperativa. Están organizadas por vecinos de aquí de la comunidad para producir alimentos para la comunidad, y estas unidades que empezaron con muy baja producción y poca experiencia se han convertido después de 10 años en una importante fuente de ingresos, o sea, de trabajo, la venta y producción de vegetales orgánicos para la población, los cuales son muy saludables.
So what you're looking at is essentially they created a lot of urban cooperatives. Some of them are not sort of cooperative, some of them are actually they have a hierarchy, but it's still owned by the state, which is sort of a different version. But this one is essentially a neighborhood cooperative that had some land, and the state gave them some sort of funding to develop the land, and the people that live in that neighborhood, if they want to work there, they can. And they either get paid a wage from the proceeds of the food, or they get their food at reduced cost. So I would kind of put this under the model of both a consumer / worker cooperative, or a hybrid version. And I was actually a couple of years ago in 2012, I was actually able to go to Cuba to interview some of these folks, and it wasn't a legit interview. I just went. I wanted to check it out, and I talked to some of the workers there. Actually, I think one of the ladies that comes out in this, I was able to actually talk to her. And I wasn't expecting it to be her, but she was there, which I thought was cool.
Nosotros en este tipo de agricultura no utilizamos ningún tipo de componente químico. Aquí no se usa nada químico, aquí todo es netamente orgánico. El trabajo de los organopónicos, de cultivo y cosecha, es intensivo. Nosotros cosechamos en la mañana y en la tarde estamos cultivando nuevamente.
nosotros, principalmente yo, llevo 4 años aquí trabajando en esta VPC. El salario es muy bueno, la comida es buena, bastante aceptable. Nos sentimos bien entre compañeros, nos llevamos bien.
Nosotros aquí hacemos la función de cualquier cosa, vaya. Lo mismo hacemos canteros, que sembramos, que recogemos y hacemos cualquier tipo de trabajo aquí. En eso no hay, lo mismo ella que yo. En eso no hay ningún tipo de situación en cuanto... Todo se hace, vaya, todo, nosotros, en general todo. Ella está luciendo el girasol, vaya, de la mujer cubana.
De otros países del área capitalista, que los productos orgánicos son mucho más caros que los productos convencionales, o sea, que se producen a través de procesos químicos. Nosotros vendemos mucho más barato los productos orgánicos que los productos que se procesan, que llevan proceso químico. Cualquier producto de la agricultura, digamos la lechuga, por citar un ejemplo, la lechuga que se produce convencionalmente en Cuba alcanza un precio hasta de 4.50 y 5 pesos la libra en los mercados normales. En estos lugares vale 2 pesos la libra.
Why do you think that is? So they're talking about how the organic products in their country are actually cheaper than the sort of chemical, like grown ones, which is the opposite of how it works here, right?
Yeah. Are you talking about homegrown? Well, both categories are homegrown.
No.
One's imported and one's...
Well, not only is one imported, but one's also grown in the countryside. So like when you're doing mass production out in the in the middle of nowhere,
Right.
it costs money, like oil money,
Right.
to import it, to transport it into the city. And here, like we sort of that cost isn't, it's sort of externalized because we subsidize that industry. We subsidize the corn industry, so like we're not, this is sort of an important point I think a lot of people, it gets lost on. We don't actually pay the full price of a lot of our products. And actually, get into watching Food Incorporated and sort of how like the reason we eat all the things that we eat, everything's made from corn, is because we're heavily subsidizing it. But here we have the opposite problem where like, even at a fast food restaurant, you go buy a salad, it's like $6. And it's not even like good lettuce, it's that like iceberg lettuce that has no nutritional content versus a hamburger. And because of sort of and this is sort of one of the benefits of, I think you all know about the Cleveland model, right? They started the hydroponic farm, is that if it's locally sourced, it can be produced cheaper because you don't have to worry about transportation costs or even shipping costs. It's sort of one of these things that if you do it efficiently, like it's ready to go. People can even just come there and buy it, which is one of the ways that they did. So they had like a little poster there at the front where you can actually just buy your produce there. So instead of like it coming to you, you go to it. And it's not even that far, it's across the street from where you live.
O sea que en lo social brindan alimentos frescos, crean empleo, mejoran el aspecto general de las áreas de la ciudad y por supuesto que constituyen un ejemplo para las nuevas generaciones de la producción agrícola.
One of the things I think is really interesting about this, earlier we were talking about sort of systems change, right? Is that it's not just about the workers, getting access to affordable food. It's not just them, having employment that's sort of dignified, they can make a living off of. But it's all sort of a lot of other kind of problems. The transportation issue, right? So like if you don't have to transport, thousands of pounds of like lettuce or any kind of produce, what do you need less of? Oil. If you need less oil, how does that have effect, especially in the United States, with our international foreign policy?
Yes.
Wars.
You know, like we're involved in wars because we're trying to like access these resources, right? So it to me, I was sort of really fascinated by this video, and I was like, wait, I need to like, is any of that kind of stuff happening here in the United States? And you know, people were talking about Argentina. I'm sure you know of the worker factories, the covered movement over there. So I saw The Take by Naomi Klein, and I saw a lot of stuff happening outside, and I was like, who's doing that stuff here? And so that's why I went to the Bay Area. That's where I found it like a large. It's large for it being in the United States, but not really that large. I went up to visit. Somebody told me about a group called the Network of Bay Area Worker Cooperatives, No Boss, spelled BAWC. And so, you know, it was a group that they were sort of basically worker cooperatives that met like on a regular basis to talk about sort of issues and how they can support each other. And through them, I met sort of different organizations. And I've always been interested in this from like the macro and the micro level. On the micro level, it's like really the transformative power of these institutions to really help change people's lives. There was another organization that I didn't include in my dissertation because of sort of privacy issues that I had with them. They didn't want to share their information. They didn't want to be named. But it was essentially a women's cleaning cooperative. And you know, someone who comes from an immigrant background, you know, I know a lot of my family like has done that work. You know, they clean, you know, wealthy people's homes or, you know, the universities. And one of the things that I really found interesting is they were the most vulnerable people in their communities, right? Like people took it. You want to talk about exploitation? A lot of these women get paid at the sub minimum wages. Sometimes they get treated really poorly by, you know, their employers. But in this cooperative, they were making $15 an hour before, like we were talking about raising the wage, just like, you know, 5 or 7 years ago. They had full benefits, which is unheard of in that industry, absolutely unheard of. But most importantly, they felt they had dignity at work. They can go to work and make decisions on what kind of products they were going to use. They weren't using toxic products, you know, ammonia and that kind of stuff is like, you know, like the intake of that stuff on a daily basis is going to affect your health negatively. And so they were using all organic products to clean. And also, if one of the women called in, you know, she needed to take her son to the doctor or something, she wasn't scared of losing her job. She didn't have that like ongoing fear where she felt like maybe she had to come in on like sick. And especially in the restaurant industry, this is really common. Like a lot of people get sick because workers are sick, and sort of they didn't have that fear. They can call and say, hey, I can't make it today. No big deal because you're one of the bosses. It's just, you know, you have to figure out, you know, your new schedule or whatever to get somebody else. There's more flexibility. And then I came across this woman named Ale, which I named Ale, Alejandra, who had a really unique sort of story. She had been involved in cooperatives in Mexico. So she was university educated. She went to go teach in the countryside. Specifically, she went to go teach in Chiapas. You all know about Chiapas? Yes. Zapatista territory. So autonomous regions of Mexico is sort of this interesting kind of indigenous revolt that happens in 1994 because of NAFTA, and they control these spaces autonomously. And one of the things that she was involved in is she went to go teach there, and she saw that a lot of the women sort of lived in poverty because they didn't have jobs, but also that prevented them from having independence or freedom if faced with domestic violence issues. And so she tried to like, she didn't really like it was sort of, it just kind of grew sort of organically, this project she did. She saw that they were making like little handkerchiefs that had the flowers like embroidered on them. And she knew, because she came from a city, that there was tourists that would buy like shirts. They're known as the blusas bordadas. And they're really beautiful, like Mexican shirts. They're really colorful with flowers all over them, all hand stitched and embroidered. But they didn't. She asked them, why don't you guys make shirts? They're like, what for? Like, we're not gonna use them. Like, you know, they're making handkerchiefs for each other because they use them. And so she says, well, if you make me 5 shirts, like, can I buy them off of you? Like, if I pay you, will you make me 5 shirts? And they're like, sure. So she gets like 1 or 2 people to come in and like embroider them. And she takes those 5 or 10 shirts to Guadalajara, which is the big city that she's from, and she sells them. And she starts making these trips, and so more and more like women start coming to her door and say, hey, I want to make some shirts for you. I heard that so and so made 5 shirts for you and you paid her this money. And with that money, they started buying sort of, like more tools and supplies, like stitching equipment, that kind of stuff. They actually made a couple sewing machines so that, like, they can actually sew the shirts themselves instead of like hand stitching the actual the stitching of the shirt, but not the embroidery. The embroidery is all handcrafted. And so this project that started with like one or two women turned into basically a whole village community of women who are producing these shirts, and to the point where tourists, instead of her having to go to Guadalajara to sell them, they basically started coming to Chiapas sort of territories, and they saw like one time I think she mentioned there was some Swedish people came through, and they were like, we want all of them, we want 100 of them, and they were like, what? And so they just started producing these shirts. And one of the things is, so it helped them financially, which is great. That's always awesome. But I think what she really saw as sort of empowering the women is that they had sort of, she noticed more independence in them, that they weren't as afraid to sort of stand up for themselves in relation to their husbands or their sort of partners, on issues of, sort of like domestic violence, or even not domestic, but just like on an everyday basis. They didn't feel like they couldn't say anything, because now they were also contributing to the family. And so, long story short, she says, when the women saw that after 15 women came and then 20 women, and so we started a cooperative. Then we had 100 community women working in the cooperative, and I traveled to Guadalajara because there were too many blouses and we no longer knew what to do with them. I began to travel there to sell the blouses and reinvest. When we had sufficient money, we decided that they would earn 75% of the income from the work and 25% would be reinvested. Obviously, we did not pay licenses or permits or taxes or anything, so 25% remained for the cooperative, and 75% would go back to the women who built it. It changed and turned into something somewhat revolutionary because women began to generate income. 3 years after we started, we had a workshop, we had a bodega store with fabric and threads, and we were taking blouses to Guadalajara and Mexico City. And she continues on, she says, if in Chiapas, by working together, we were able to successfully develop a project, then maybe we can, I'm missing something. The goal was to develop a cooperative to help women, so this is what she's talking about. So she came here to the United States. She essentially met an American over there, got married, came to the United States. But here, she was undocumented. So she went from being a university educated woman who had rights and was a little bit more privileged in Mexico, to her status changing over here. And what happened is she faced domestic violence issues here. And so in her head, she joined a program that was for domestic violence survivors, and they were trying to empower women. And so she got kind of a part-time job developing a project. And so she went back to her prior knowledge, said, hey, maybe we can start a cooperative for the women here, so that the number one thing that keeps women from sort of leaving those kinds of situations is the economic insecurity. What am I going to do? How am I going to feed my kids? How am I going to sort of take care of them? That kind of stuff. And so she goes back to this experience and she says, well, maybe we can do that here. And so when I met her, she talked way longer than I'm going to talk. She talked for 2.5 hours, and she was just really animated. And she was talking about how they were starting a restaurant cooperative, a catering business, and she was struggling here because the husbands of the women were really against what they were doing. But it's because they know if they're making money, it's sort of this then you're not forced to rely on me. But I actually I was really moved by this, because it shows sort of that cooperatives it's not just about having more income. It's that it's bigger than that. It's about changing people's lives. It's about empowering people to live full and happy lives. And then this got me to really think about even in how our society is really kind of sick, in the sense that the biggest question you get asked growing up is, what do you want to be? But what is that question really asking you?
How much money do you want to make when you grow up?
So how much money do you want to make when you grow up? But also, how do you want to sell your labor? Mm-hmm. Right? Not hey, do you want to develop, these talents, or, I want to practice art, or I want to develop, my full humanity, all the kind of interesting things that make you sort of unique. The number one question that is valued here is, how are you going to sell your labor? And the reality is that most people don't ever get the job that they want. Most people end up having to work some kind of job that pays the bills, and maybe they develop hobbies and interests and they do other things. But that wouldn't be such a problem if working was only part of your life and not all encompassing part of your life. And so this is, I think, I think Richard Wolff talks about this a little bit in Democracy at Work, where he and other people have said this also, is that we need to develop an economy where you are working to live and not like living to work. And so this sort of story was really interesting to me because it really showed like this is why it's important to like do the work that you all are doing to teach people about cooperatives and actually help us get started. I also met this gentleman named Max, who was really interesting, and he has a like sort of really unique story, and he was cussing my ear left at my ear left and right, which I thought is actually I felt really weird because I presented this in front of that symposium I told you all, an academic setting, completely like everybody's wearing suits. And I was like, should I change it? I know sometimes in books they change and I'm like, nah, because I'm trying to give voice to these workers, and he's a worker. So Max's story is he grew up in Florida in a poor community, poor rural community where they grew watermelons and other sort of farm sort of things. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Immokalee workers. It's sort of this community of like indigenous Mexicans and indigenous kind of different groups of indigenous folks who basically live out in the middle of like nowhere, and they're like really they're peasants basically. I hate using that word, but that's how they're treated. That's how the bosses think of them. And so he grew up in this sort of poor environment, never saw sort of a future for himself. As a teenager, he stole a car and he got caught up and he went to prison. When he got out, or right before he went in, I forget how he told me the story. Right before he went to get in or he got out, he got his girlfriend pregnant, and she moved to California to try to make it out here. That got him to really think about like what does he want to do with his life. And so this is a person with a record. I don't know if you all know in Florida, like you can if you commit a felony, you can never get your vote back. You're pretty much done. Like you can never vote ever again. And so this person who's politically been disenfranchised, he remembers sort of like worker struggles, and he was kind of associated with them, like not the Cesar Chavez ones, but Cesar Chavez type sort of like organizing drives, and he was associated with them. But like he got like a lot of my friends growing up, they got caught up in sort of the system, and so he went to prison, got out. He moved to California, but he struggled trying to get a job. You all sort of know statistics about prisoners. I mean, it's one of the reasons we're trying to get rid of the box. There's a movement to get rid of that question because, people have done their time, they've served their time in society, they shouldn't be sort of ostracized for what they did in previous life or a previous part of their life. And so I asked him about, why, like, what the cooperative was able to provide him that he couldn't get anywhere else. And he told me this really interesting story. He said, this shit is really important to me. When I think of my history as a worker, a farm worker, and I did other stuff too, like construction and shit. I've milked cows before at a dairy farm. I've been in so much different shit, man. I'm a worker, you know what I'm saying? And in every single one of those fucking jobs, that's all I was. I was a worker, and it meant something different to me, and I definitely took pride in the work that I did, because I've always been a hard worker. But I was always just, I don't know, right? Now, worker has a different meaning. Right there, he's pointing to he was just a worker. Most people in society don't feel valued. And in his cooperative, it was different. And he was even having trouble expressing, you can see, what that meant to him. Where was I? Before I was a worker, which meant, that I was working for this person and I worked hard, and that was how I had job security. But here it's I'm a worker and an owner, and an owner too. I don't know, man. It makes me feel that's how all workers should feel, because when you don't own it, it takes something away. The pride aspect of it, the joy of being a worker, it just takes. I don't know. I can't explain it. It just feels different. As a worker owner, I feel fulfilled, like I have a purpose. One of the things that is not up here is that Max, the cooperative actually allowed him. It was the only place that would hire him, and it allowed him to actually be able to have partial custody of his daughter, because he now had an income, so he can see his daughter, because they split up. And beyond that, it also gave him health benefits. He actually went to go visit the doctor for one of the first times in a really long time in his life, and he found out that he had a tumor in his brain. And because he had health benefits now, they were able to kind of remove it, and he was living a healthy life. And they told him that had he not had that, he would have been dead already. Within 3 or 4 months. from that. And so not only did the cooperative allow him to like be a part of his daughter's life and to not fall into being that sort of stereotype, especially in being criminalized, but actually literally like saved his life. And these are the kinds of ways that cooperatives, because they don't value profits, they value jobs, they value the people that are in them. I mean, profits are important. You got to keep a business sustainable in order for you to have a job. And so I was really grateful to these two people who, I mean, there was a lot of other folks too who share their stories, but these two I think really exemplify the type of changes that can happen on an individual level in terms of cooperatives. It's not just about more money in my pocket. It's about what that means. It's about the fact that I don't have to work another job. That means I can spend time with my daughter. That means I can have health care. That means I can sort of donate, or I can create programs that help women get out of difficult situations. And sort of, it has a lot of these sort of ripple, we talk about multiplier effects in terms of money. This has all kinds of multiplier effects in terms of like social good and social benefit. And so and especially this is for me really important because these two folks that I highlight are Latinos, right? And Max is one of the most intelligent people I ever talked to, because he was sort of talking about this in terms of being reflective about sort of his role. So he saw that, like, okay, it was great that he was making more money, but he also talked about it in the context of like, he said, I also feel fucked up because like I see the kind of people that come into the bakery, because it's a cooperative, so we charge more for our products, and I feel like we have a part in, we're sort of gentrifying this neighborhood. So this bakery was near the Mission District, but it was on Valencia Street. And sort of the Mission historically has been like a community of color, and sort of like those folks are getting pushed out. And so he was trying to like situate his own position in terms of like the capitalist economy that was happening around him. And so he said, we have to figure out how to do this without at the same time gentrifying our communities. And it's sort of an interesting thing that like I actually think about in terms of like how East LA is being gentrified. And the irony is that East LA is being gentrified by Latinos. Like brown people are gentrifying brown neighborhoods because you have college kids who go off to college, they make better incomes, and they come home and they have middle class tastes. They want Starbucks, they want like those hip bars like Eastside Love, which are cool bars. But like they're essentially like the old mom and pop places that used to be there are getting pushed out, but they're getting pushed out because of who owns the properties. And it's the people are like saying, hey, there's this new sort of demographic that has a lot of money, so we're gonna raise rents here so these people can buy that. And that's where like sort of like establishing cooperative business is important, but we also at some point have to deal with like who owns the property. So establishing public land trust is really important. Talking about nonprofit ownership of land, so that if it's really sort of ironic because we talk a lot about capitalism and we're anti-capitalist, and I tell my students all the time, like, we don't just live in a capitalist society. Like, what do you mean? It's like, how many people here like rent? A lot of them are saying, who do you pay your rent to?
Landlord.
I don't know. The corporation.
Yeah, but what are they called?
Landlords.
Land what?
Lords.
Lords.
Yeah.
So we live in a feudal society, but like the capitalist is the dominant form, but we're still paying rent like they did during feudalism. And so it's one of those like multiple layers of like exploitation. And so if we don't deal with the land question, like you can start a worker cooperative, but all the worker cooperatives are going to be doing is paying rent on their business, and they're still going to go home with like little to no money. So it's this really kind of difficult thing. And so one of the important things that I kind of was trying to point out here is beyond their stories, this is what we were sort of talking about earlier, is that it's really important as we do this work, is to create essentially an ecosystem. How do you insulate worker cooperatives who will have to be competitive, but at the same time you can insulate them from the market in certain ways. You can protect them. Just the way that the United States before we did free trade, we protected our sort of commerce by charging tariffs to other countries. Well, you can kind of do that not without like taxes and tariffs, but you can do that by spreading knowledge about worker cooperatives. You can do that by setting worker cooperatives strategically. You start one business and then you start another business that services that business, and sort of you start a chain, right? Another way is which is the Cleveland model, which is the anchor institutions that you talked about, you mentioned. Part of this is building communities. Like, how do you get engaged in communities and build communities, which is really a social process, and it's actually not rocket science. Y'all know how to have a party? Who likes to have a nice party?
Yeah.
Like, do a little bit, drink some beer. All you gotta do is invite your neighbors, right? But like, we're not used to kind of doing that with them, and part of it is also we gotta have boundaries. You know, you don't want like your neighbors to know, or you don't want your neighbors to be that drunk person. You gotta watch. But it's, essentially it was sort of all these different things that I noticed, and it's like there's a lot of people that are focusing on the anti-capitalist stuff, and we need to do that. We need to be out there protesting Trump. We need to be out there protesting like the sort of. But a lot of that stuff is, and I don't want this to come out the wrong way, but it's going to sound that way. It's reactionary. You're reacting to what they're doing. But who's out there, like, what is the vision that we want to see? And so part of that, which I think is great that folks are finally I mean, Richard Wolff, has been talking about this for a really long time, and that like starting up these groups, Democracy at Work groups, where we move not just from talking about them and even spreading knowledge, but to actually starting to build all these sort of different things. Like, how do we get city governments to invest in cooperatives? So I was just talking to a friend of mine who works at the School for Workers in University of Wisconsin, and the city of Madison is going to invest $3 million into cooperative development. New York, just a couple years ago, invested a couple $1 million also. How do we get City of Santa Monica to do the same? How do we get Long Beach? How do we get these elected politicians to see the benefits of these things? Especially because they're looking for answers, and the only answers that they get to hear are developers' answers. Oh, let me create jobs. I'll start a Starbucks and look, there's more jobs. But they're poverty jobs. So that money is going to get sucked out anyway. And sort of, you have this sort of development cycle that never actually develops communities. And so what it boils down to is, creating quality jobs. One of the things that I think is really beneficial about cooperatives and sort of other economic democracy solutions is you're creating quality jobs and ownership where workers have not just a voice, but active participation and power, right? Like, I'm a union person. I grew up in a union household. My dad had a good job and benefits because of his union. But like, he didn't have, like, unless it was through collective bargaining, he didn't have power to, like, you challenge his boss. You don't have to challenge your boss when you are the boss. You might have to challenge your other bosses. So in that sense, it gets difficult because it's not just one boss. It's 20 or 30 or 40 bosses, and so you have to learn how to communicate. You have to learn how to do consensus building. You have to learn how to facilitate meetings. It takes sort of a lot of that kind of work. But everybody feels valued, and everybody is allowed to participate, and everybody ultimately has some form of power. Anybody can suggest a change. Anybody can suggest sort of something different, or like, let's introduce a new product. If it doesn't work, you take it off the shelf. Those sorts of things. But ultimately, I think for me, is transformative is that people are living with dignity and respect in a society that doesn't sort of give them. Like somebody says, it chooses up and chooses out. Y'all ever seen the movie Modern Times?
Charlie
Charlie Chaplin, like Modern Times. I think that was really a genius film that showed sort of, and this is also kind of, I'm gonna get all philosophical with the Matrix. And both films are showing the same thing in that they're both showing essentially how in this system we keep the machines running, right? So like, he is an appendage of the machine. That's why he's going through the motion really fast. Like, he's not controlling the machine; it's controlling him. And in the same way, like in the Matrix, they call Neo, they call him Copper Top. And the way the machines get their power is actually by sucking the life energy out of people. Well, that's what the society, like this economy does, right? Like, you wake up every single day, you go to work, you get home really exhausted, and you go through like decades of your life, and you wonder what happened to all the time. I was working. For who? Somebody else. So, one of the things, the benefits, it expands access to a better quality of life, and fulfillment, where you're, like, you work as a way to sort of earn income, but that's sort of not you developing your own life. So building a self-sustaining ecosystem is a really important part of that. It's not just the job; it's sort of the ripple effects that has. With sort of environmental issues. If a community has to decide on what kind of products it's going to use, they know that it's damaging to my kids to use toxic products, maybe we're not going to use those things in this community, that kind of stuff. I also didn't talk about, like how cooperatives are like, they're perfect because they're loyal to their community. Like to get a cooperative to move, you would have to convince everybody that owns that cooperative to go move somewhere else. This is also a challenge though. This is why cooperatives don't naturally grow. Because there's no incentive for the people that started the cooperative to go start a cooperative over there because they're not going to benefit from that cooperative. Which is why I think the Arizmendi model is actually really ingenious because it's a franchise model. And sort of it's kind of a pay it forward. Like we're going to help you out, get started, but once you're up and running and profitable, you have to pay into this organization so we can help start another one. And it's basically you use it, and part of it is also branding, like to be known as Arizmendi, to like as the name, which sort of now people recognize it. You get benefits from that. You're like, oh, that's that good bakery. It's like the one over there, and you have the same kind of products. And so I started doing that work initially, and then I started kind of really like trying to analyze. Okay, so now that I see the benefit of this, of these cooperatives, I also don't want to just be like a cheerleader. I want to also like try to understand what the complexities are, especially as it relates to issues of race and sort of racial inequality. And there's some general theories of racial inequality that are out there. Critical race theory started out by the Delgado Stefanik, which argue that race is central to most of the institutions that function in the United States. The criminal justice system is inherently racist. I don't know if you all sort of have heard that. So the criminal justice system is created in the United States as a mechanism to criminalize former slaves and to put them into prisons, to create the prison industrial complex, because like sort of imagine you're sort of been freed, right? Like your natural inclination isn't to go work for your former plantation master. And so the plantations had to figure out a way, well, we still want to grow cotton, we still want to grow whatever we're growing, tobacco. How are we going to have a captive labor force that we had before? And so the way that they did it is they basically criminalized African Americans with really petty crimes. They came up with what are known as black codes. So sundown laws, you had to have, like, if you didn't have like formal work, you would be in prison. So this is connected to some kind of vagrancy laws that happened in England. And so what they did is they essentially imprisoned a whole population of people, put them in prisons. Hey, now we have these people just kind of lying around. The plantation owner would talk to the warden and say, hey, what if you let me borrow them for a while? And they sort of made that deal. And so they're arguing that, these institutions are inherently racist. It places race as a central component or position in any legal, educational, social policy, and institutional analysis. Another example is the educational system. So before, when we had segregated schools, we had Mexican schools here in Southern California. The Mexican schools, or the Mexican kids in schools, had a very different track of education than white kids. The Mexicans were taught home economics and shop classes. And the purpose of educating Mexicans in the Southern California region and across the United States, or the Southwest specifically, was to teach them how to do the jobs that they were meant for in the society. And in sort of before 1950s, the African Americans didn't start coming to Southern California until the 1940s and 50s during the war years. Like, it had been Mexicans primarily providing most of the labor. And they were doing all the hard sort of labor. And so the school's job was to teach them to fill those roles. So that's where you get like all the nannies and all the like Mexican sort of they clean houses and all that stuff. And so, but like racially, we're racializing the educational system. And so, I kind of explore these different theories, and racial formation is sort of along the same lines. It talks about how race is a primary factor in the development of U.S. politics. But I also problematize them because, for me, race is a central component, but so is gender, right? I mean, we talk about free labor, talking about women's labor has historically been like forced to be free. And not just gender, there's also sort of LGBTQ issues, there's all kinds of different like types of oppression that, for me, like are central to the functioning of the capitalist sort of economy. And so, I sort of explore these different sort of theories. And I want to also introduce intersectionality, which is actually, a lot of people don't really understand or know that it's actually based on the idea of triple oppression, which was first introduced by Claudia Jones in 1945. Claudia Jones was a Trinidadian sort of woman. She's so Afro-Caribbean, but she's black in the United States. And she was speaking to a Communist Party. She was a Communist Party member. and she's speaking to the party at like a giant assembly, and she told them that like she could never separate. So there's a tendency to always try to separate things out, like race from class from gender, and I can't separate those things. I am all three at once, and I am affected by them in various ways. And sort of Kimberly Crenshaw then talks about in 1991, specifically she writes an article that talks about how different groups of women experience domestic violence differently. So white women sort of experience it, they in certain ways that they might report, they might not report, but African American women carry a different burden. So what is one of the stereotypes of black men in the society? There's a lot of them. One, that they're violent. The other ones that they're criminals, right? There's sort of this criminalization of African Americans. So African American, she was saying that African American women, so that experience domestic violence, often are scared to report it, not just because they fear for themselves, but they're scared of contributing to that stereotype that already exists of their men. And so they feel guilty when they do report it because they're contributing to that discourse that has a larger societal impact on the continuation of criminalization of black communities. And so she talks about how that's something that white women who experience domestic violence don't necessarily, and they're both experiencing different, definitely difficult situations. That's another layer. And then she goes on to say that immigrant women experience something similar because of Latino communities, and not just Latinos, the Asians and sort of other groups, the Latinos being sort of when we think of immigration, that's what we're thinking about. Specifically, we're actually thinking about Mexicans. And she says that it's not just also that, but now I have to worry about my immigration status. So and this is actually something that we're actually currently seeing in today's climate, is that the police departments have already noticed a drop in domestic violence sort of reporting because they know that women are scared that if they report, I mean, the other day, I don't know if you saw this, but ICE showed up to a courthouse and actually took an immigrant woman who was actually was testifying against her partner for domestic violence. This very thing that she's talking about. And so people aren't reporting that. And so she's talking about just the different layers of how different people experience sort of these different types of oppression. So oppression is experienced differently based on racial, class, gender context, eventually extended to other identity markers, immigration status, LGBTQ. They focus on understanding how these things intersect with each other, not how they're different from each other. These things are all connected. And so, they talk about in terms of different layers of oppression. Peggy McIntosh similarly talks about systems of privilege, white privilege and male privilege specifically. And so I'm trying to sort of make sense of these theories in relation to getting to the point. And then there's also sort of Marxist informed analysis of racism, Darder and Torres specifically. And what they're arguing is that a lot of this stuff happens within a context, like Claudia Jones, her triple oppression is really tied in her experience in the United States as a worker. So being a black worker, whether her ability to get a job is more difficult because she's black. And when she does get a job, we know that she gets paid less than most other people do, right? But it's based on sort of the capitalist economy. And so cooperatives are focused on dealing with issues of generally class. One of the questions I had was, how does race and racism factor into actual workspaces that are cooperative? We tend to think of cooperatives as kind of utopian places, right? And it's important to sort of understand that they're not going to be. Workplaces, like any workplace, are going to be contentious. And I think it's important, when we start sort of developing work cooperatives, to think about what are the ways that we're going to approach these different things, and being mindful not to be colorblind, to understand that people have different experiences and experience work very differently. And so some of these theories really help me understand the different type of experiences that workers at the same cooperative were having. So workers of diverse backgrounds experience life differently based on racial and other identities. These theoretical frameworks help us understand the internal day-to-day behavioral dynamics of work relations within cooperatives, even when there is an attempt to create inclusive and equitable work environments. They help us understand how workers individually experience social inequalities. And so at the micro level with the workplace, and I've given these people different names for obvious reasons, she says that everyone is on the same page about the business, but there is issues of race. Class, gender, and sexuality often surface even though there's an intentionality within their cooperative about addressing them. So even in places that understand and talk about intersectionality and sort of these issues still kind of pop out because of just different cultures sometimes there's tension. And it's not anything that's like tension because, I'm not gonna get like clash of civilizations with, like different religions and stuff. It's just more of like day to day, I have tensions with my sisters all the time. It's sort of basic stuff like that. But how do you work those things out? I think is important. And so she says, despite as much as we may try, we will still see forms of oppression kind of springing forth here and there. It's disheartening, but it's a good reminder that there is so much work to be done. On one level, it's hard because you see hierarchy sort of forming here in a way, like some people's opinions could be taken more seriously than others. And I think she was sort of referring to sort of gender dynamics, how men sort of like, and this is something I try to be mindful of, not interrupting people, but like, I'm sure the women in the room have had a great idea and nobody listens to you, and then a guy says it, and all of a sudden it's the greatest idea in the world. And it's sort of those types of things. Some people's opinions can be taken more seriously than others, or some people talk more than others, or some people take on more responsibilities, or some people are more dominant in this workplace. And I think a lot of times it has a lot of overlap with race, gender, class, and you'll see that happening. So there's that, and it's not horrible, and we're constantly trying to work on it. Like you'll see people having a moment, I'm talking a lot here, I need to step back. People are growing and learning and getting better at it with me, with time, which is appreciated. So there's that, that's difficult. Then there's also this notion of our different sense of priorities could be difficult because none of our priorities are all the same. But there was a large division in our co-op, it's still kind of lingering, of like Latin American immigrants versus everyone else. There's these bohemian non-immigrant people, and then there's Latin American immigrants who are trying to hold it down. So there's definitely a cultural and definite social division happening here. And so she talked about how at her cooperative, there was essentially like these like immigrant folks who were like really barely struggling to survive and sort of got to this place. And there's sort of college graduates who see this as kind of a utopian kind of thing. And so she called them bohemian. But like, it's how do you manage these different sort of cultural backgrounds and even like, ideological kind of differences. Some folks, they just want to work for like a good wage and a living. They're not interested in toppling the capitalist structure. I mean, if it happens, as long as they get paid, they're fine. At the end of the day, they just want to feed their kids. And so and so I think intersectionality and sort of those racial issues really help me pull out how different people experience that. She understands that there's a life difference and a difference in the magnitude of struggle between gender, national origin, class, and race, which affects the way that people interact at work and specifically what they take for granted, different systems of privilege. One of the things that she also told me though, on the benefit though, is that, and I think I might actually include it at the end, but in case I don't want to forget about it, is that when she was hired, it was the first time she had ever been hired by a woman, and it was the first time she had ever actually been hired by 4 women. So she was like essentially interviewed by two white women and 2 women of color, and among them were also LGBTQ women. And so like in that 4 group, like she was like, wow, this is really diverse. And so she was African American, or actually Afro Latina. And she said this was the first time that she never had to perform like, like at a job interview. I mean, we all kind of do that, right? But especially like, people who were even like, I was talking to my class the other day about hair politics. African Americans have to worry about sort of hair politics and them sort of having to flatten their hair and that kind of stuff because otherwise like, oh no, you're too cultural, all these biases. And so she was like just really surprised. But that's only something that can happen in a space where like ownership is shared, as long as you're intentional about those kinds of things. And so she felt she like could be herself right from the get-go, which is what people should be if you're trying to hire, like you're trying to actually get to know who the real person is. Osvaldo mentioned you could see this divide in our, so it's going back to sort of the kind of the rifts. You could see this divide in our cooperative, pretty clear too, between Latino and the LGBT community. And whenever we're making decisions and voting on them, you can see like a clear line, in terms of which way people are voting. It's very visible, everybody sees it, and we're only now starting to talk about it. But I think that's important because in a traditional workspace, you wouldn't talk about it. You go to the boss and you expect the boss to kind of deal with it, and they don't deal with it, they just kind of write people up if they need to, but there's no resolution to this like tense workplace. And here, even though they're having difficulty, they're talking it out, which is kind of essentially you're doing group therapy, but it makes groups like stronger. Like there's more understanding that happens in those spaces. Like you hear each other out, even if you disagree. I always tell people there's nothing wrong with tension. Like what's wrong is if you don't deal with it. And sometimes it's okay to like just, you know, kind of hash it out. Like, what's the problem? And we're really bad at communicating in society. And I think it's important. That's why I'm interested in the consensus building. That's, you know, we need to do that. There aren't clear dividing lines. Samantha is Afro-Latina, and so like he mentions clear dividing of Latinos and LGBT, right? But Samantha is Afro-Latina and self-identifies as LGBT. Osvaldo grew up in Florida as a farm worker, but both privilege different sort of identities over others. So like, where does Samantha fit? If he's talking about like Latinos in the LGBT community, she's Latina, but she's also LGBT. So it's this thing that, you know, people's perceptions of things are sort of based on their own experience.
And we have like probably like 2 more minutes
Okay.
before we
Cool. Sorry, you should give me. So
I should have given you a heads up earlier.
Yeah, you give me a heads up earlier. So it leads to sort of this so one of the things we have to be careful is that it doesn't lead to oppression Olympics. This conversation doesn't lead to like, you know, like who's more oppressed than who? Skip. At the macro level, there's sort of institutional problems with, I noticed that a lot of the service sector jobs, like service sector cooperatives, like, you know, cleaning cooperatives, were all done by Latina women. A lot of the engineering sort of cooperatives, it's all white men. And so, like, if we're really going to change the economy on a large scale, we have to be intentional about making sure that, like, it's not just about creating cooperatives at the micro level that are better wages for those people, is we have to do a better job also diversifying the whole field of the cooperative economy. And that means, you know, essentially making sure that those engineers, cooperatives, are mindful that they need to go out and recruit black engineers and brown engineers and women engineers, which we know is a problem, like, to begin with. Women in STEM is not sort of promoted. Yeah, that's what all that says. So challenges and opportunities, sort of, instead of like it just being part of, so one of the things that I think is really important is that a lot of people talk about cooperatives as this niche kind of thing within capitalism. Oh, this is this cool thing that we can do to kind of survive. To me, it's actually a fundamentally different, like, economy. It's an economy where workers, again, own their means of production. They, again, control their labor rather than being forced to sell it to somebody else. And I think that's really kind of the important part, is that that in being mindful of those things is that you can create not just your own job, but also be mindful about the community that you want to live in, so that you don't reproduce kind of capitalist structures like gentrification. I'll let you all read this. There was other kind of sort of issues, but essentially cooperatives provide opportunity to escape racial, gender, sexual, economic inequality, at least in the workplace and the labor market, but only if people are intentional about dealing with these issues on the forefront, and not assuming that they can be, that the cooperative itself, just by itself, is going to sort of get rid of these sort of inequalities.